them birds.
Those things are always waiting on something to die so they can eat it, right? What a weird job. That's an airplane. I wonder how long it's been here. It's probably one of those drunk doctors. Yeah, they're always crashing their plane, you know?
Oh my God, look at this.
Those are $100 bills.
I think it's drug money.
You know, what if this guy's a dope dealer? We're just like Robin Hood. It's a police matter now. What do you think we should do?
What if we didn't turn it in?
It's stealing.
It's the American dream, and a gym bag, he just wants to walk away from it.
You work for the American dream. You don't steal it.
Then this is even better. $4 million.
Look how square it is. So somebody comes searching for the money, I'll burn it. Look, we got to be agreed on this. Would you have done the same thing? I mean, if you'd been there instead of me. I wish somebody else had found that money. Does it scare you?
Yeah, it scares me. What if he tells somebody?
Just stick to the story and we'll skate right through.
Man from the FBI is going to be driving through. Think they're looking for a lost plane.
I want my share.
Plans to sit on the money till we decide that it's safe to keep. It's like there's two sides now. We're all in this together, man. You got to pick right now. Who be? You're my brother.
From now on, we have to be thinking ahead all the time.
There's someone who's been properly trained. There are many ways to detect a liar.
Just a normal guy, a nice, sweet, normal guy.
No.
No, they won't.
You think you can take us out there? Can you tell us what this is all about? Looking for a plane? I'm taking the money back right now.
You gotta get out of there.
Everything okay?
He's gonna shoot all three of you as soon as he sees the plane.
Don't move! You gotta make this look like it was an accident. They're not gonna take me away, are they?
We're the ones who need that money. He just wants it.
Put the gun down!
Shut up.
Well, I'm trying to come up with a plan.
Don't turn your back! Think do you feel evil? I do.
Hello YouTube, Film Buff 06 here, coming your way with my review of the criminally underrated 1998 neo-noir crime thriller film, A Simple Plan. Obviously not to be confused with the band A Simple Plan, which premiered that year's Toronto International Film Festival, was distributed by Paramount Pictures, was adapted by Scott B. Smith from his own same-named 1993 novel, received only 2 Academy Award nominations, i.e. for Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Supporting Actor, was directed by Sam Raimi, the same guy who gave us the likes of The Gift, not necessarily the 2015 film with Joel Edgerton, but rather the one from 2000 with Cate Blanchett, Darkman, Drag Me to Hell, Oz the Great and Powerful, and especially the Evil Dead and original Spider-Man trilogies, was the last film to be produced by now defunct production company Savoy Pictures before it filed for bankruptcy in November 1995. Stars Bill Paxton, Billy Bob Thornton, Bridget Fonda, and Brent Briscoe, who, if you don't know him, he was the garbage man who goes over to the Daily Bugle to lend J. Jonah Jameson Spider-Man's mask in Spider-Man 2. took partial influence from both the Finders Keepers episode of Arthur, in which the titular character and his friends Brain and Binky start to fight over how best to use a mysterious key, and the classic Simpsons episode 3 Men and a Comic Book, in which Bart Milhouse and Martin Prince fight over a prestigious first standard issue of Radioactive Man, and tells the almost Hitchcockian story, which is almost quite similar in a way to that of Fargo, The Maltese Falcon, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and especially Shallow Grave, of 3 men consisting of brothers Hank and Jacob Mitchell and their best friend Lou, whose lives change forever when they come across a crashed single-engine plane in the wintry Minnesota woods containing the horribly decaying corpse of a dead pilot and a mysterious duffel bag containing over $4 million. Hank then comes up with the seemingly simple, sensible, and foolproof idea that instead of risking being too greedy with this money, they safekeep it until someone eventually turns up to claim it in the springtime when all the snow and ice have melted. However, this simple plan starts to go horribly wrong and spiral out of control as Hank, Jacob, and Lou essentially start to become slowly corrupted by this money and start to become extremely suspicious and paranoid of one another and end up turning against one another over what best to do with this money, and thus begins a web of lies, deceit, betrayal, and ultimately murder straight out of a classic Shakespearean tragedy. So, what are my thoughts on a simple plan? Well, first of all, I would obviously like to address the elephant in the room and get the only negative, or rather nitpick, that I have with this movie out of the way by asking a few simple questions. Why the hell is this movie so underrated? Why the hell is this movie so underappreciated? Why the hell has this movie been so overlooked in recent years? And more to the point, why the hell isn't anyone talking about this movie anymore? Not only when it comes to the fact that it has a certified fresh score of 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, but also especially when it comes to the rather interesting body of work Sam Raimi has built for himself over almost 5 decades. I mean, I can somewhat understand if this is because of the rather bullshit and unfortunate fact that at the time this movie massively underperformed at the box office, largely due to either the way Paramount initially marketed the film as just a simple thriller, or the fact that it was in direct competition with the likes of Shakespeare in Love, You've Got Mail, Patch Adams, and especially The Prince of Egypt. But regardless, this forgotten gem deserves to be talked about a hell of a lot more and given much more of the true praise and recognition it deserves, which is thankfully exactly what I'm going to give it in this review now that that's out of the way, because A Simple Plan is such an incredibly well made, fantastically acted, intelligently written, flawlessly directed and edited, entertaining, suspenseful and tension-filled masterpiece from beginning to end. And as you can tell, I absolutely freaking love it, and can clearly see why it was held in very high regard at the time, along with the likes of Shakespeare in Love and Saving Private Ryan, as one of the very best films of 1998. In fact, I could even go as far as to say that outside of the original Evil Dead and Spider-Man trilogies, this is probably one of, if not Sam Raimi's best film by a freaking clear country mile. While I can sort of see where the minor legit criticisms of the story to this movie, admittedly being a bit derivative, unoriginal, and having already been seen, done, and told before in other better movies, such as only 3 of the movies that I mentioned earlier are coming from, I still think the filmmakers managed to inject a little bit of unconventionality, freshness, and originality, and thus managed to execute the story superbly well by not just having it essentially be a character study, but having it also be a Stephen King-esque modern Shakespearean tragedy stroke morality play about human selfishness and greed, and how these two vices corrupt and change you for the worse, and ultimately drive you to commit the most unspeakable acts of evil imaginable that you would otherwise not think yourself as being capable of doing. Plus, it does admittedly take a while within the first 10 minutes of this movie for the story to get going, even though it does become very easy for you to make the argument that it is sort of necessarily paced that way in a sense because you needed some time to introduce and set up the four main protagonists without having to risk falling into the dreaded trap of spewing far too much unnecessary exposition. But regardless, I thought the pacing of this movie was just perfect. It keeps you on your toes, makes you think about what thematic ideas the story is presenting to you, makes you understand where each character is coming from, and clearly understand their individual motivations for wanting to get their hands on this money. Never once fails to leave you on the edge of your seat and allows the story enough room to breathe and develop, as well as take so many unpredictable twists and turns throughout its running time that you're always left feeling like you're being taken for a wild roller coaster ride and wondering what the hell is going to happen next. Also, the opening sequence of this movie, which I'm honestly surprised a lot of reviews for this movie have almost completely forgotten to praise or even mention in particular, where we don't just see a flock of hungry black crows about to devour what turns out to be the corpse of the dead pilot, but we also see a fox sneaking into a chicken coop and then managing to steal one of the chickens is just such a terrific visual metaphor to start the movie, even though it may otherwise look like a film cliche on surface level, and actually had me in goosebumps both times I watched this movie. However, upon rewatch, and thanks to reading some of the reviews out loud, as I sort of admit to usually doing most of the time, I grew to at least understand, admire, and respect the meaning behind it in terms of visual storytelling a little bit more than I did the first time. And I'm actually of the opinion that it is such a grossly underrated and actually quite clever piece of visual cinema trickery from Sam Raimi that really shows how much he wanted to show his audience what's happening in the scene, as opposed to telling them via an exposition dump. Speaking of which, Sam Raimi proves to us why he was just the most capable and perfect director to helm this movie, with his surprisingly masterful and much more restrained direction. I mean, boy, can he direct this movie the same way I'd imagine someone like Alfred Hitchcock or Stanley Kubrick back in the day, or the Coen brothers, who actually gave him some advice about shooting in the heavy snow, believe it or not, or Quentin Tarantino, or heck, even Christopher Nolan doing it. and even when you watch this movie, is all the more amazing to see how much he had matured at this point as a filmmaker, especially when you take into consideration the fact that the guy was initially extremely well known for making such visually and enjoyably flashy, campy, silly, and over-the-top blockbusters as Darkman and the original Evil Dead trilogy. Scott B. Smith does such a fantastic job adapting his own novel for the big screen with one of the most complexly and intelligently written screenplays I've ever heard in my 26 years of life. Ala Kivelo's cinematography is just some of the most beautiful and stunning I have ever seen. Plus the set design and Minnesota locations look fantastically authentic, lived in, gritty, believable, and as close to realistic as you can get. Danny Elfman's score to this movie may feel completely different to the usual type of whimsical and occasionally bombastic score we've nowadays come to expect from a versatile composer of his caliber, but it is nevertheless subdued and brilliant, and perfectly complements the dark and suspenseful tone of the movie. The performances from everyone involved is just terrific. Brent Briscoe is a great supporting player as this not necessarily likeable, imperfect, flawed, drunken, abrasive, hot-tempered, irrational, overtly greedy, covetous, and untrustworthy arsehole that is Lou in this movie. Bridget Fonda is also great, and not to mention surprisingly drop dead gorgeous as Hank's wife Sarah, who also plays a pivotal Lady Macbeth-like role in this movie by indirectly seducing and manipulating her own husband to keep this money in order for them to secure a promising future for their unborn child. Now, let's talk about one of the two best performances in this entire movie, and that is, of course, from Billy Bob Thornton, who not only deserved his supporting actor nomination for his beyond fantastic portrayal of Jacob in this movie, but also, in my honest opinion, should have freaking tied with Sir Ian McKellen, either for Apt Pupil or Gods and Monsters, in winning that Oscar instead of James Coburn turn for affliction. And the funny thing is, as much of an interesting character actor as Billy Bob Thornton is, and as much as he is basically playing a variation of his Oscar-nominated lead role from Sling Blade in this movie, it could have been so ridiculously easy for this performance to fall flat on its face like a pancake, and for him to essentially portray this character as almost like a cartoon stereotype, or in other words, like Cletus the slack-jawed yokel from The Simpsons if he were live action. But not only does Billy Bob Thornton make Jacob's character in this movie a wholly believable, three-dimensional, incredibly sympathetic and quietly sort of tragic figure, but he also fantastically manages to subvert our surface expectations of his character in a way that particularly reminded me a little bit of Lenny from Of Mice and Men, in the sense that on the surface he is otherwise considered to be the village idiot, or at least the one who doesn't really seem all that intelligent or the brightest bulb in the box, or doesn't seem to know what the hell he's talking about most of the time. But as we see his character develop throughout the movie, he completely simultaneously surprises and touches us with how slow and gentle, but yet kind-hearted, sensitive, morally conscious and sober-minded he truly is compared to his brother and best friend, especially when you take into context the idea that the latter two are not exactly thinking as clearly or rationally as he is about the horrendous situation they find themselves in throughout this entire movie, and also really with how sadly and rather tragically divided his otherwise quite loving relationship with his brother really is, especially evidenced during the more personal, emotional and heartbreaking scenes of dialogue throughout the movie between the two of them. The other great performance to know, and my personal favourite of the two, comes from Bill Paxton as Hank, who goes through such a dark, complex and compelling character arc stroke journey fit for a tragic modern Shakespearean villain that you just cannot help but feel sorry for throughout the entire film. And he essentially becomes the Macbeth of this movie, minus the gruesome and bloody decapitation at the end, in the sense that he starts out as this likeable Jimmy Stewart-esque nice guy who seems to have everything the American dream has to offer him on a plate, including a decent education, friendly relations with members of his local community, and a perfectly gorgeous wife with a baby on the way. But once this damn bag of money comes into his life, that's when things really start to dramatically unravel, as he becomes a bit more dickish, selfish, untrusting and paranoid about what would happen if his brother's best friend, the FBI, or anyone else were to get hold of this money. Sort of similar in a way to how Ron was affected by the Locket Horcrux, and especially Frodo the same by the ring. And he is ultimately driven to commit some of the darkest, most immoral, shocking, dishonest, villainous and wicked things imaginable, even going as far as to brutally murder a poor and unfortunate chicken farmer, his brother's best friend, as well as his brother's best friend's wife, all in one go. Both scenes of which, by the way, were so intense, powerful, and tension-filled that I was just left gasping in utter silence, shock, and disbelief. 2 FBI agents, and even assist his own brother in committing suicide in an emotionally heartbreaking, tragic and powerful scene towards the end, in order to try and maintain the charade and keep the whereabouts of this money a secret from the public. And once he eventually does decide to finally get rid of this bloody money, full stop, by, spoiler alert, burning it despite his wife's protests not to, that's when the burden finally begins to lift from his shoulders, and he finally gets the chance to return to a normal life with his wife and child, while still deep down at the same time having to live with the terrible consequences of his actions, and how much this negative experience has morally affected and changed him. Very much similarly to Frodo towards the end of Lord of the Rings: Return of the King. Speaking of which, a lot of people complain that the rather bittersweet ending is a bit stupid, nonsensical, completely out of left field, and anticlimactic, and indirectly part of the reason why this movie didn't make as much money at the box office as it probably should have. I sort of personally fail to buy into this argument because, in my honest opinion, not only does this ending make an awful lot of perfect sense to how it neatly ties together stroke resolves everything within the actual plot, especially if you do what I did and rewatch it 2, 3 or multiple times beyond the first viewing. But also, all I can say about it is that it is one of those satisfyingly ambiguous endings fans to a great film like Inception or The Shining or 2001 A Space Odyssey that never fails to leave things open to interpretation and always leaves you guessing and asking so many interesting questions after you've watched it. In conclusion, I absolutely love A Simple Plan. It is one of the greatest examples of a criminally underrated, overlooked, and underappreciated suspense thriller film ever made that deserves a lot more attention than it has been given. It proved to all of us that there was more to Sam Raimi than just being known for directing the Evil Dead or Spider-Man films, and that he is actually more capable of handling much, much darker and mature material than people sometimes give him credit for. It easily ranks right up there with the first two Spider-Man films as hands down one of my all-time favourite Sam Raimi films. I cannot freaking highly recommend enough that you go and check this underrated gem of a masterpiece out as soon as you can. If you are a Bill Paxton fan, a Bridget Fonda fan, a Billy Bob Thornton fan, a Sam Raimi fan, or if you're someone who is into suspense thrillers in general, it's easily one of the best films of 1998, one of the best underrated suspense thrillers ever made, and my overall rating for A Simple Plan is of course an awesome-tacular and perfect 10 out of 10. Now, please feel free to leave a comment in the section below, and please let me know your thoughts on A Simple Plan, as well as let me know what your favourite Sam Raimi film is. Plus, feel free to subscribe to my channel as always, as well as go to my channel page and click on the little bell so that you get all of the notifications and updates from my channel via email. And also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to join my Facebook group page, as well as follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And until my next video, which is going to be my special Christmas collection update video for 2018, do take care, everyone, and Merry Christmas for tomorrow.